This podcast is created for farmers and powered by Pioneer Agronomy to bring you agronomic insights and proven solutions to fuel forward-thinking farming.
Hello and welcome to the July 2nd edition of the Indiana Pioneer Agronomy Podcast. I'm agronomist Brian Schrader on the east side of the state of Indiana, joined by my co-host, fellow agronomist Carl Joern on the west side of the state of Indiana. How are you, Carl?
Brian, I'm doing just fine. Got a heat wave here in northern Indiana as of late, and so crop is moving right along.
Very much so. We have reached those temperatures where you remember that growing degree accumulation actually stops. We get over 86 and that process, technically it doesn't stop. It just slows down to the point where the plant works itself kind of to even, if you will. But we consider it stopping at 86. And so we've definitely reached that temperature the last several days. So
yes. Hey, I've got one for you here as we get rolling. I had a question somebody had heard, an interview or something on, I don't know if it was RFD TV or an Ag Web Journal or something, to that point, it was, you got your GDU accumulation calculator and it taps out at 86. So that means there is no benefit to having higher temperatures. At what point, Brian Schrader, as an agronomist, would you say that there's a deleterious effect of all of a sudden it's getting too hot for our crops? Is it 87 degrees? Is it 90 degrees, 95, 100? Where are you at on that spectrum? Because I think there's room for negotiation there.
I think there is. I think the negotiation in my mind, I'm thinking about how much soil moisture that I have. I recall many years ago, probably, I don't know. We should really talk to the horses out of the horse's mouth on this one. But many, many years ago, Dr. Nielsen had taken a sabbatical and, as I recall, spent time in Australia and New Zealand looking at corn production. And he had pictures where it had gotten so hot that it had literally aborted the pollen before it got to the grains or got to the silks.
To the silks. Yep.
And to the silks. And I remember that. And I was thinking that temperature was well over 100 degrees. Okay. And so my mind goes, hey, 100, 105 degrees. But quite honestly, I've seen 95 and no soil water do a lot of damage to a corn crop. The other piece of this, obviously, as you and I know, is the plant growth stage is incredibly important. But for me, I'm going to say I probably get a little nervy when we get to 100 degrees. Yep. That's probably the number that I would say in my mind that when I see the thermometer legitimately get to 100 degrees, not the heat index, but legitimately get to 100 degrees, I probably start to think, ooh, what's this going to do to our crop?
Yep. Okay.
What's your number?
Well, I said give me mid-90s, and I think we're probably experiencing some kind of tax on the plant, and maybe there's a plateau between those upper 80s to through the low 90s is what I said. But yeah, to your point, if you interrupt the reproductive processes in corn or beans, right? In corn, we're ultra sensitive because you got about a week's worth of true optimal pollination window. So we're just, we're really aiming for an ideal forecast there. With beans, they could be in the reproductive stages in terms of pollinating, flowering blossoms on plants for quite some time. So there's more room for error, but there's also the concept of, blossom abortion, and that's a big component of yield reduction. So just, as we get going here, I was curious what your thoughts were, because I think some folks were saying once you get in the 90s, and I said, I don't know if it's that low. But
yeah, I'm kind of with you on that. If I had to just put a number on it, I'd probably say 100, but you're right. There's a lot of impacts as we lead up to that. And then growth stage, obviously we know that's a huge impact for both crops on when we see that heat. Even, guys that, have late maturing wheat this year could potentially see a little bit of impact from some of these hot days. Most of our wheat was, I think, well past being impacted, at least up here. But I'm sure that if you had some super late planted wheat, that may have even had a little bit of impact on it. So every crop will be impacted by excessive heat for sure.
That's the way we'll see. Yeah, we'll see how those come back on the wheat crop this summer.
Yeah. Well, that's obviously, I think, a topic that we can dig into a little bit more on some things. That the weather's been so strange this season. We went from what I feel like was an incredibly cool planting
Mhm.
season and early emergence, especially on those first planted fields. And now we're just in a heat wave where a lot of this late planting, the tail end of May,
Mhm.
even into June now, are really being impacted, especially during early development. So,
Yes.
what does the crop look like in your part of the world, Carl? I honestly, my travels have taken me east, not
Yep.
west this summer. And so I don't have a good feel for what things in the state of Indiana look like much west of US 31, to be fair.
Sure. Candidly, I think we're sitting on a really good crop on the western part of the state. I say that though, and I took, went out to visit Dad here over the weekend and drove out to, Peoria, Illinois area, and crops kept looking better and better the further west you went.
Okay.
Over that way, they've gotten an excessive amount of rainfall, but between here and there, I mean, you could tell they got planted earlier than us. I'd say just, road farming and scouting here. I mean, stuff was probably getting pretty darn close to tasseling. I thought I was seeing flag leaves out there on
Wow.
corn. So they're significantly further ahead. And, that's coming from Northwest Indiana where we had a really good planting season. We had pretty good
Yeah.
conditions throughout and got the crop in at an earlier rather than just timely standpoint. But with these high temperatures, we have experienced leaf rolling, as early as mid-morning, and so that's got a little bit of consternation amongst, the locals. But as we know from a lot of good research, early, mid vegetative stages, it's like we can do just about everything except kill the corn crop in the month of June that we've
Right.
got just from local, recent history that can still have really good corn yields come fall. So I think the month of July is more make or break than the month of June with
Okay.
respect to weather.
I,
So
I know soybeans have been a question. You and I have talked about soybeans a couple different times as we've had conversations not related to the podcast. You mentioned it this morning as we were getting set. What does the soybean crop in your part of the world look like?
it's a tale of two different crops in my opinion, and it comes back to just about every other spring, especially cooler springs like we were relating earlier. No-till beans versus worked ground beans is really what I'm saying. And
Okay.
the earlier you're planted, there's not in a cool year you don't have as much of an incentive in terms of that early growth, and so from a developmental standpoint, a lot of beans are flowering as we crossed over the summer solstice. But with that said, in a cooler spring when you're not, mineralizing as much nitrogen or sulfur, and you look at what's kind of limiting in the early stages for beans, well, you don't have good nodulation until you look at that, third, fourth trifoliate. And so you can really see it's kind of like rapid growth syndrome in corn. It's like you can see the plants that now have the nodal root system on corn versus those that are getting off the seedling roots. It's two different crops. Same thing with respect to beans. If you have good nodulation, those beans are taking off and you're nearing canopy. Those that are, a couple of leaf stages behind is all it takes from one side of the lane to the other. It looks like you're calling your local field person saying, "What the heck is going on out here?" And it's truly just the difference in stage. So,
Yeah. Over here, the rhizobium issue is that we've just been so waterlogged.
yes.
Rhizobium require a fair amount of oxygen. They need good soil conditions to be able to really get started. And we have been so waterlogged. Our soybeans in a lot of places don't look great. They are starting to come on finally,
Yep.
but we've got pockets that have been dry. Now we've got some pockets that over the last 3 or 4 days have gotten an excessive amount of rain from these pop-up showers that have occurred. But you can dig up a soybean plant, and if the soybean plant does not look good, doesn't have any nodules on it.
Yes,
They're just
exactly.
not there. And so that's really the culprit over here. But it's more related to, I think, the water than it is the
Yep.
cool for us
Yep.
at least. So
Yep.
yeah.
That tracks. That tracks.
Yeah. Okay. Well, one of the things on soybeans too, Carl, that I've gotten a fair amount of calls about that I think is worthy of just a little bit of conversation with this high heat is what kind of crop response we're seeing when we're spraying our post herbicide applications. We've got good weeds. The crop may not be growing quite like we would like it, but the weeds certainly are thriving. And so we've got pretty good sized weeds. Guys are going after them. We're, obviously following recommendations to put our residuals in. A lot of those residuals carry a lot of oil. As Brad Burkhart, our crop protection specialist, who's been on the podcast many times, will tell you, that can get pretty dicey, even in a year where it's not super hot because of all that oil we're carrying around. And then, in this year, you add in 95-degree temperatures on the days that you can actually spray because it's calm and it's not raining, and that you see some response. And so I've had a fair amount of phone calls from guys about herbicide response on enlist soybeans, maybe a little bit more of our enlist droop that we often talk about coming on. It doesn't last any longer, but they certainly see it probably a little bit faster because of the temperature. And so I think the two cautions I would have for everybody is, one, if it is possible to not spray when it's 95 degrees out, we would encourage you not to do that. But we also recognize that, those are the days that it has been fit to spray because of, low wind speed and those kind of things. The other thing is to expect that. And as Carl mentioned earlier, I would say, remember that most of these applications have been made either right at or prior to bloom starting. So you're not impacting much, if any, of the yield making parts of your soybean crop. The other side of it is remember that soybean bloom abortion is a normal part of soybean development. Early on, you're talking about as many as 80%, I think they often say, Carl, that you'll abort. And so you're probably not having any lasting impact on that soybean crop. It certainly doesn't look good, and you feel, a little nervous about that, but with some moisture and some good growing conditions, they'll recover pretty fast. But just be mindful of the amount of oil that you are using. And then the other piece is things get hot. We have weeds that are starting to harden off. I've seen some water hemp that I'm already a little surprised at how much wax is actually on the leaf surface already. And so that's going to take some more product, some more water to get in there to be able to make sure that you get that lethal dose 50 to those weeds to get them killed. So that's, something else to be cognizant of as you're going out to the field, at least in my mind.
Great call outs. Brian, what I try to encourage folks to do is just think about you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't, is maybe how some people feel when it comes to, having a hotter load in the spray tank. Yes, there is crop response. No, we don't want to do any damage to the crop, putting unnecessary tax on them than we have to. As you're already going through some, like we're talking about, are you getting into some stressful conditions from a heat stress standpoint? However, let's just take your standard defoliation chart, related to, hail damage that a crop adjuster would use. I'm looking at one right now where at the R1 growth stage, you can lose 80% of your leaf mass and only see a 5-6% yield reduction. I would stand to reason that we're probably not going to see that much type of crop response with the hottest of loads. It's probably closer to 20%. And you think about the yield impact that you have if you let those water hemp compete all season long. It's going to be a whole lot more than 5-10% in terms of yield reduction from that.
Yeah, I just go back into the way back machine. When I started in retail, it was still pre-Roundup for the most part. I mean, there were some Roundup beans out there, but we were still doing a lot of conventional stuff. And an incredibly hot load was a pint of Flex Star. And I am not endorsing this. Please do not do this. But at the time, this was a labeled tank mix that was available. And it was a pint of Flex Star and a pint of Bassagran. And then we would add Post Plus. And it was fire coming out of the booms. And we would spray that, and you would literally see crop response in a large field. You could actually see the leaves starting to turn colors from that mix. When you got out of the field, when you folded the sprayer up. And we had good beans. I mean, for the time, obviously they wouldn't compete today, but the crop response was noticeable. I mean, impressive, yes. And so I just go back to that and I think about, at least my brief history in the business and what we used to do just as standard fare. That was just the way you had to control weeds at the time because you didn't have any better options.
Yes.
And so that I just think about that whenever I think about crop response because we just roasted them. We just really did. So,
yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's I think just as we were talking about on the corn side previously today, it's this idea of I'm aiming for 300 bushel corn and 100 bushel beans is kind of how everybody's thinking of their production right now. And I think the yield reduction you're seeing is not, it's not at that 300 bushel corn level or 250 bushel corn level. It might be at that David Hula 600 bushel corn level.
Sure.
But that's what's keeping us from getting there. It's at what point in the production that you're actually starting to tap into that yield potential versus yield realized. And that's something that I think is just obviously tough to unpack, but giving folks peace of mind that what we're talking about right now isn't keeping you off your APH by any stretch.
Yeah. One other call out on soybean herbicide that I'll make mention of very quickly would be that getting a few guys in my part of the world that are struggling a little bit or don't feel like their enlist has been as effective as they had hoped to.
Sure.
I believe that in a lot of cases, this is an issue with AMS. And again, going back to the folks in crop protection, they will tell you make sure that you have the appropriate amounts of ammonium sulfate in that load. If you are using a liquid formulation, ensure that you are getting the equivalent amount that you would if you were using the dry granulars,
Sure.
the 51-pound bags. That appears to be a culprit for folks that just don't feel like their enlist is doing what it should. Track that down. Water, obviously, we know you got to have enough carrier volume, but the ammonium sulfate, especially as we get hot, will be a key part of that. And so just something to mention to folks as well if you're concerned or struggling or trying to decide what you need to do there. So that's just a couple call outs on herbicide, just because I'm starting my round of post application on soybeans in this part of the world and had several calls last week, Carl. So
Yes. And, adjacent to that, thinking about Liberty, you've got the perfect Liberty window right now as a tank mix partner. You got 90 degrees, 90% humidity, sunshine. We should really be mopping the floor with some of these weeds with that type of system.
Yeah,
but
for sure.
But anyway, that aside.
Well, let's change the subject to corn just briefly again here. I know that you had an opportunity to have some conversations with Dr. Telenko. There's been, a lot of things made of the early tar spot finds across now several counties in the state of Indiana and others in Illinois. At my last view, I don't believe there were any Ohio counties yet on the monitor. But I guess I'd be curious. You've had face-to-face conversations with Dr. Telenko. What's her opinion of this tar spot development? Especially, it seems early by the calendar to me, and it's definitely early by crop development standards.
Yes.
And so I guess I'm curious about those two things, and maybe if she mentioned any kind of switch, or is it just purely environmental at this point, Carl, or is there something bigger going on? I don't know if you spoke to that or not. So
serendipitously ran into Darcy up at the Penny Farm, and just so happened that it was a handful of days following their first find with respect to tar spot, and not easy to find that following week. So when myself and local sales rep went out with superintendent there at Penny, it took us a beat for us to find some tar spot ourselves in that same research trial. So in terms of conversation with Dr. Telenko, we found it. It's on a known hybrid that has a very high degree of susceptibility to tar spot. It's in a no-till system. And it's continuous corn for, the idea of being the tar spot magnet, the sentinel plot type of concept that you referred to, Ryan. And so, no need to sound an alarm, just as years gone by, you find the first one in the state, probably still a month out from doing anything active management wise. It's more of an awareness that yes, it's present. And her commentary was, and my observation as well, we're finding it on the thumb leaf, like on the very first leaf or two of the plant. And at that time, you're looking at 3-4 leaf corns. There wasn't a whole lot there.
Yeah.
And so the comment was made, well, since we saw it this low in the plant, it wasn't a healthy, corn plant by any stretch. It looked pretty pukey, cool spring, no-till conditions. It looked like it was not happy, but it was actually senescing the bottom leaves of the canopy.
Okay.
So you're more left with like the undeveloped whorl. So could this be, in years past, could you found it if you were looking, but if you got there 4 days later, you don't find it because those leaves have senesced type of deal.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's the up close and personal, not something to, get too stirred up about. And, as Ben had commented last week, or a couple weeks ago now, that he had found some, the day after he'd recorded his little, soliloquy there. And it was, kind of same deal. It's not something that he's ringing a 5-alarm fire. It's just, it's present. So.
Yeah, at this point we've got I just pulled up the monitor as you were sharing, Carl. We've got, let's see, 3, 4, 5 counties in the state of Indiana. You had Porter County, which is the penny farm, on the 11th of June. And then it took us a full almost 2 weeks. So to the 25th, before any of the other counties that are now reporting have come on. And I know that there's been a lot of folks actively looking for it. So if it's out there, either they're going to turn several on today or tomorrow probably, or we're just not finding it yet. And so I think that the key thing to reiterate here is not to go out and spray a bunch of fungicide on R5 and R6 corn at the moment. But I knew that Carl had that conversation. And so it was worthy of at least getting something directly from the source for tar spot information in the state of Indiana. So for sure. Yes. So I think, we've talked a little bit about the heat impact on corn and when we were starting out this morning. I think the other thing I will mention is, at least on the eastern side of the state, corn development is on pace because of the GDUs. But what I'm finding is a lot of corn fields that are starting to have areas of the field that are much taller than others. We're seeing a lot of that ugliness, that variability. Now, in all the fields that I have been in, as long as the corn was green, not the yellow damaged stuff at the edge of ponds or something like that, Carl, one of the things that I'm finding is that physiologically, so growth stage wise, all this corn is very similar in a particular field. They're just physically very different in terms of size.
Yes.
Way to think about that for folks is to think about, two brothers. Maybe they're, the twins, actually. This is more common than folks realize. One's 5'9", the other one's 6'1". It does happen. It's odd. It's different, but it happens. It's a very similar situation that we're trying to describe to you in cornfields. So, all the corn may be at V6, but we've got some that's 30 inches tall and some that's, 22, 24 inches tall. And so we're starting to see a little bit of that. But when you see those kind of situations in your part of the world, especially early, let's say pre-tassel, what's your thoughts about impact to yield in those situations, Carl?
Yeah, that's a tough one, Brian, because oftentimes when I find, size variability, it is tied to developmental difference, that you're a couple leaf stages behind or separated, and that can be attributed to, pest pressure. Like in my neck of the woods, I've been on as many, if not more, Asiatic garden beetle calls this spring than in recent past. But if you truly are seeing the same developmental stage, and I do have fields like this. I had one that was an awfully low pH field, and the nodes were really stacked on top of one another, but where the lime pile was, they were you had a lot more size to it, but the same growth stage. I wouldn't get overly concerned about something of that nature. If I do see the crop with size variability and, leaf stage development differences of a couple leaves or greater, now all of a sudden, if it's not in the same pocket, like you're referring to, ponding or replant, Now I'm kind of worried about, am I going to pollinate at the same
Right.
time, or am I
Sure.
going to be having runts, chase me
Yep.
all season long? But if you
Yep.
got same developmental stage, just size differences, that's not something that's going to really raise my eyebrows. It would have to be the difference in development. I'm curious how it strikes you, just given that you've been seeing more of it this way
No,
yourself.
I agree completely. That's really been the discussion that I've had with many of the growers, and it may not always be right on, but they're within
Yeah,
one.
within a leaf or a
Yeah,
half or
within a
something like
leaf or
that.
so. As your comment, when you get past two leaves, our own Pioneer research will tell you that once you get past two leaf stages, you can start to run into some problems, especially late with pollination and some level of competition there and things like that. So I recognize that, but for the most part, I don't really see any kind of yield robbing issues as long as
Hmm.
we're close. Our physical structure, our physical height is a little bit strange, in terms of being different in different parts of the field or even next to each other. I'm not usually that nervous about it, at least at this point. You
Yep.
do have to monitor it, as we get into pollination, just to be sure everything is pollinating correctly.
Right.
But I don't get too nervous about it. But we've had a lot of challenges on the eastern side of the state with water. And so we've
Hmm.
got a lot of these ponded areas or areas that, little different soil type that didn't get either emerged or they did get emerged and were held back a little bit, and they're just nodes are stacked.
Yeah.
And so you can definitely see it. Some of that will correct itself as we get closer to tassel. Height differences tend to go away maybe, or maybe they're a little
Hmm.
less noticeable as we reach tasseling. But in terms of yieldability, I don't think that just physical height has any impact on yieldability personally.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, no,
So
I agree. And, what could you attribute that to? Could it be slight differences in terms of planting depth? Could it be, if you had some bounce in the planter, could it be, evenness of soil moisture as you're getting that, put in? It sounds like in your case, how how wet was it when we drug the planter through type of
right,
deal, as opposed to for my circumstances, it's usually the other way around.
right, yeah,
We saw a decent amount of anhydrous and starter fertilizer injury this year.
okay,
And same deal, right? You nip those seminal roots coming off of the kernel, and that can be enough to really set you back. Does it set us back two leaf stages, or is it one leaf stage? And that's
yeah,
kind of where we get back into this conversation of
yeah,
what should somebody do with that type of information. But yeah,
yeah,
interesting call out. It'll be fun, if you're playing along at home, flag a couple of those plants and see if Brian and I are on it, or if they wind up getting crowded out or, shadowed and shaded by the
yeah,
towering neighbors. It does come down to how different they truly are, if they're going to develop into runts or if they'll
yeah,
be able to compete with the
yeah,
big boys.
yeah, for sure. So,
So,
well, Carl, I don't want to say it's been an uneventful week because there's been plenty of conversations leading up to this that's kind of informed our topics today, but it's been the same thing. I really haven't had anything out of left field in the last couple weeks, really. So I'd be curious, anything odd or out of left field that caught you? Those are always interesting for us to either learn from or to hear about. So,
um, yeah, discretion's the better part of valor, so I won't name any names, but
oh
we've been
yeah,
chasing down some interesting things on just sprayer challenges. Whether it's an instance where you got, a lot of crop response almost in the way of like a gramoxone type of deal.
mm,
And I'd leave it to you, Brian, in terms of, how a sprayer functions, but we were able to trace that back to, some hot loads that came out of a particular, provider. Also had another one where, uh, if memory serves, I think we're getting a higher rate out of one component of the tank than the other, and that's what was throwing us some interesting crop response. It almost looked like an HPPD, but it was truly just an excessive rate of liberty.
oh wow,
That we're seeing in terms of crop response on corn, and it was very much to the line of,
wow,
where things were sprayed or where they weren't. Had another good one where we had Liberty applied on Liberty tolerant corn, and you could again see to the line of what got sprayed versus what didn't get sprayed. And it was wrapped up as if it was hit with a high dose of a growth regulator.
Yeah.
And grower says that they do their own spraying, and they didn't
Sure.
they didn't dump anything that
Yeah.
wasn't supposed to be in there. And it was, well, that's kind of part of being an agronomist. It's you as the grower tell me what took place, and I'll tell you what the plants are telling us.
Right.
It's kind of like being a veterinarian. Your dog can't say, hey, I've got
Right.
a heart murmur or something like that. You got to just
Yeah.
kind of put the scope to them and do some investigating. But yeah, we've had some interesting ones that have taken for a guy like me a little bit more sleuthing, and then you have to start going back to where did the sprayer come from, what was in the sprayer beforehand,
Yeah.
where did it go, where we have stops and starts, it helps tell the story. But yeah, we've had a good number of those here in the last couple of weeks that have been head scratchers.
Sure.
For answering your question about anything weird going on
Yeah.
out there.
Yeah, those are always the ones that you learn from. You may not pull it out of the memory bank very often, but when you deal with one of those and kind of chase them down, they're incredibly valuable, because not
Yes.
only does that learning, that sleuthing that you mentioned, help you in other cases, occasionally something will repeat itself. Your
Yes.
comment about the corn that was twisted up, looked like a growth regulator on it, but didn't have it. I've had that experience before, actually. And so you don't see it often, but when you see it, now you know what to look for and how to figure it out. So yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
No, those are the fun ones. They come oftentimes at the cost of a grower, but in terms of learning, they're incredibly helpful for us as agronomists and for the growers as well. So I appreciate you sharing those.
Yeah. Well, and that's one of those where, right, a grower calls their trusted advisor. And if that's their sales rep or their field agronomist or, a retail partner, and you're asking for an opinion because we have the opportunity to see those, one-offs with regularity. That's what makes up our week more times than not.
That's right.
Whereas for them, it's a once in a farming career type of deal. And if the question is, do I rip up this stand of corn or leave it? We could probably give you a pretty good answer off the cuff on that.
Yep.
Then it's, how did we get here? How do we avoid it in the future? And that's where everybody learns. And yeah,
for sure. Well, I think we've probably covered everything that we need to cover today, Carl. As we sit here, we are headed into the 4th of July weekend. We hope that everybody has a safe Independence Day, enjoys the holiday, but also recognizes the fact that we do live in a country where we're able to basically do what we would like to do when we want to do it. And certainly the news here recently tells us that that's not always the case across the globe. And so just would take a moment, recognize just what it means to have the freedoms that we do. And so this is a good holiday to be able to do that. So any big plans for the 4th of July, Carl, for the Joern family?
Oh, that's a good question. I think we're gonna be holding down the fort this Independence Day. We got the 3 little kids running around, so we'll have the sparklers and poppets, but that'll be about as big as our fireworks show goes.
Nice.
And I'm sure we'll go someplace around town for a little bit of a fireworks display.
Okay.
But yeah, how about in the upland area?
We will be traveling. We will be camping on the 4th of July
Nice.
This year. So that's something we've not done before over the 4th of July. So we'll do that this weekend and see how we get along. So
absolutely.
Yep.
Well, hopefully the forecast turns around for us.
Yes.
We can get some cooler sleeping conditions.
That's right. Yeah. So with that, Carl, we'll call it an episode. If somebody heard something that they wanted to get in touch with you about on the podcast, or they want to follow along about what's going on in Northwest Indiana, how could they do that?
Check it out on Facebook at Joern Agronomy is probably where you can get the most regular updates from me. How about Brian Schrader?
Yeah, probably the best place to get a hold of me would be B_K_Schrader on Instagram. And if you want to shoot me an email, brian.schrader@pioneer.com is easy too. So with that, we'll call it an episode. Thanks for joining us for this edition of the Indiana Pioneer Agronomy Podcast.
Thank you for listening to this episode from the Pioneer Agronomy team. Be sure to visit pioneer.com/podcasts to access additional episodes and learn more about our extensive on-farm data and innovative digital tools that are fueling forward-thinking farming.